Greetings, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to NNV News, the Black Narrative segment where we interview Black professionals and activists on issues impacting the Black community, and we do it from a historical and social context. Today, we're examining the economic warfare and the wealth disparities within our community. We first want to say that we want to dedicate this program to Baba, Dr. Conrad Worrell, and to Representative John Conyers, who were on the front line of advocating for reparations for our people. Today, we are joined with Brother Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, who is the Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community at the National Community Investment Coalition. I want to greet you, brother, in the greeting words of peace of Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me, brother.
Thank you, brother. As you all know, that the COVID-19 has exposed the devastating effects of the system of white supremacy on Black people, from police brutality, summary executions, to inequality in education, healthcare, and economics. And that we all see these disparities and these inequalities. They are very stark today. One of the things that the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan teaches is that business is warfare. And that the three scientists that Black people were never to be taught was the business of mating, the business or the science, of mating, the science of business, and the science of warfare. And we can see that playing out today. What we want to do is to give some context to our topic today on economic warfare. And we want to start off with the impact of slavery. Brother Dedrick, can you give us an understanding of how the injustices and the lack of I guess reparations, if you will, how has that put us in our position today?
Well, I always start off when I do presentations on the racial wealth divide. I always start off with this idea that the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. And this is getting more and more discussion. People are understanding racial economic inequality, racial wealth inequality, but this isn't a new understanding, right? This is something that people, and particularly those of us who have been striving against white supremacy, have understood. Again, it wasn't bad personal relations that led Europeans to enslave Africans, right? It was the desire to use them to build wealth for themselves. Same thing with Native Americans. It wasn't bad personal relations between Western Europeans and indigenous people in the Americas. You're going to have bad relations with people whose lands you're trying to take. That's just inherent, right? And so and I think too, so oftentimes people they talk about racial inequality, they want to talk about race relations, like how we get along with one another. But how we get along amongst one another is determined by where we are socioeconomically. And as long as we're so deeply disenfranchised, there is going to be this interaction of inferiority and superiority, because one group is superior socioeconomically as relative to another. And so we have to break that economic cycle. And, that's where I've been focusing my work. And I think that's why it's important to understand the history. And I just recently did an op-ed talking about reparations, and we did a quick analysis. It came from a paper I did with the Institute for Policy Studies called White Supremacy is the Pre-Existing Condition. And it was looking at how the racial wealth divide was around before COVID and how COVID might aggravate it. But even if COVID disappeared today, God willing, there would still be this deep inequality. But anyway, I did this op-ed that around reparations that noted that African Americans have only 4% of the wealth of the country, though they're 13% of the population. And so we would need about another $10 trillion for African Americans to have the wealth that we should have relative to our population. And so I wrote this piece about how, one aspect of reparations, should be, about $20,000 a year to every Black person for 20 years to really allow for growth and economic development as part of reparations. I mean, obviously there's many reparations plans, and there's plans, laid out by, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that are much more holistic. But just as the direct cash infusion part, I just wanted to highlight what it could look like and the magnitude of what we're dealing with just on the cash finance part, not even talking about having our own land and having our own ability to control that land.
That's right. And I wanted to, since you went to reparations, we were definitely going to touch on that last, but since we're on it, we're just going to go with it. I wanted to just go ahead and let the viewers know about reparations. First of all, and then after I go through this, if you could give us understanding, because as you say, this gap is so wide. I mean, I don't think that it's even possible at this point in time to put in any type of policies other than reparations for what has happened to us as we have been under this system of white supremacy. But listen to the America has reparated, the people that America has reparated. It says in 1862, the District of Columbia Emancipation Act paved the way to compensate slave owners of their loyalty to the Union and for the loss of income incurred by freeing slaves. And that was in 1862. In 1971, 1 billion plus 44 million acres to the Alaskan Natives land settlement. In 1980, 81 million to the Commonwealth of Oregon. 1985, 105 million to the Sioux of Dakota. 1985, 12.3 million to the Seminoles of Florida. In 1985, 31 million to the Chippewas of Michigan. And recent, in 1990, 1.6 billion or 20,000 given to the Japanese for their being internment camps. And recently, you may have heard about the story where the ruling was for the Creek Nation of Omaha, Oklahoma, where now, if you look on the map, the Native Americans in Omaha almost own about 50% of that, or they have a sovereignty of almost 50% of that state. And yet, Black people who have fought, bled, and died, for America, to keep America safe, to keep her sovereign, to keep her interests protected, have received nothing for the approximately 300 years of free servitude.
Yes, no, and I want to note, and the indigenous brothers and sisters, they deserve much more in reparations, right? It just we do as well, right? And we need to, and also, I deal a lot with the work of racial wealth inequality. So this idea of a $10 trillion, I wasn't saying that's what we deserve, because we probably deserve much more than that. I was just saying, in order for us to have a proportionate share of the wealth that our population should have, we should have an extra 10 trillion. Reparations, we could talk about, all that Black people are owed for what we have gone through, and you can't limit it to a financial number, but we do have to talk some finances in order to address that. And one other thing, is interesting. You talked about how some slave masters received reparations. And, one thing that's not talked enough about in history is when Haiti freed itself from European and French rule and ended slavery there, they, over generations, had to pay billions of dollars to France to repair France for freeing themselves from. So it's if people look at, and people call, particularly historically, look at people call for reparations like it's some crazy wild idea. You just gave a list. No, it's a common practice. People just think it's crazy when it's about us and about us. And particularly, we start talking about real transfers of wealth and not just a museum. I mean, I think museums are important. I think, different things are important, but we have to deal with the finances and wealth.
Absolutely. And then also one of the things, of course, that was mentioned was land. And that was, of course, what was I forget the man's name who suggested it with the 40 acres, but none of that was delivered. And today also we want to, with the reparations, talk about land that we can begin to build something for ourselves and secure our own future. The destruction of, and we'll as we're going on into time, we want to talk about now to dispel the myth that Black people are somehow mentally incompetent or lazy, or that, so many different stereotypical misinformation about our inability and why we're in the condition that we're in today. I wanted to just talk about the destruction of the Black Wall Streets in the 1920s, the different towns like Rosewood, like Seneca Village that is now Central Park,
Yes,
even Wall Street in the 1930s. This area was a settlement for Black people. Can you go ahead and talk about the loss of that great wealth, and then go maybe into integration, and then we'll go on from there?
Yes, sir. Yes. And I think, again, that it's not just that we've been treated bad, so we should be prepared. Wealth, massive amounts of wealth was made off of our enslavement, off of our labor, and then off of kind of our cheap labor, because in the fact that since we couldn't, for generations, we could only receive salaries much less as compared to white people. And so those profits were being accumulated by white society. So again, whether it was through enslavement, where again, and it wasn't just the South and the cotton industry, right? Like you said, Wall Street was built off of major insurance companies were built off of insuring the cargo, which was us going from Western Africa, to the Caribbean, then to the United States. So, much of the country's basic finance was created through the slave trade. And so all we're saying is that there should be some type of repair. And, that's one thing I like about the racial wealth divide, because when you talk about racial inequality, people get caught up in emotions and feelings. With a racial wealth divide, you get to look at hard numbers and the reality. And, some people say, it's equal for everybody. But what's really clear is, using the Survey of Consumer Finances, the median wealth for Blacks was $3,600 in 2016. The median wealth for whites was about $150,000, right? That's a radically different. That's a much broader inequality than even in income. And it's in terms of wealth that you actually are able to survive difficult or challenging economic times. It's through wealth that allows you to take advantage of opportunity. So you could start that business, or you could get that graduate class or certification or what have you to help you move forward in your career. And it does give you a little bit more peace of mind to know you have some of that money in the bank, and so you're not as stressed and don't have high blood pressure and heart disease and all of these things, right? This wealth is at the center. This wealth inequality and us being in asset poverty is at the center of all these different aspects of poverty that we're in. And I'll even lead it up to the police brutality piece. It's not a coincidence that there's some issues around money, whether it's supposedly George Floyd might have passed off, accounted for $20 bill, or didn't, or Eric Garner, the brother who might have been selling a loose cigarette to make a little bit of extra money, and then police attacking people for $20, $5, or what have you. It's that economic insecurity which makes us victims to this vicious policing system that in many ways is designed to maintain economic inequality, because people just won't sit there and allow people to live well while you're living horribly. The only reason the society is allowed to continue is vicious policing to keep people in line. I think that's part of the larger issue we're going to have to deal with if we're really talking about reforming police. And maybe that's some of the issues that are being get at when people are talking about abolishing police. But to abolish police, you're going to have to abolish the inequality that is causing this type of police brutality.
Absolutely, because in all truth, that is why the police were formed.
Yes, sir.
The police were formed to basically, even if the black man and woman wasn't here, the police were formed to protect the assets of the rich. And European society has always have had this social inequality, this have and have nothings. One of the things that on researching this was that in many of these areas where you have the Eric Garners and the George Floyds being brutally suppressed by and killed, of course, by the police, are on this line of gentrification. Can you talk about gentrification and how the police force, when it says protect and serve, really what they're protecting is the white community, and they're serving white interests? Because in many cases, and many of us have all seen, that police in black communities will see crimes happening or drug deals taking place, and nothing takes place at all.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And, and two, just to go back a little bit to answer more of the question you put forward, because I didn't talk too directly about it, but, you were noting how even when African Americans amongst the kind of discrimination and oppression do manage to find some type of economic success and build wealth, whether it's, Rosewood, or whether it's many countless of untold stories of that, blacks were not going to be were historically not allowed to control their own economies. And if wealth was accruing, forces were going to come in to make sure that wealth was redistributed back into white society and white communities. Yeah. And then you also put forth the question of integration. And I do a podcast on a Race and Wealth Podcast Network. And I forget Ed Getz was the professor. And he wrote a book based on Stokely Carmichael's critique of one-way integration, right? Because it wasn't just that there was integration, and so naturally black people stopped shopping at their stores. It was the way integration was formed. He noted, it's been noted in history, how school integration, that actually black educators were more likely to have higher degrees than white educators in the 40s, because that was the only profession we could go in. It was very hard for us to become professors, or it's hard for us to be doctors, or work in private research companies. And so most of our most highly educated went into the teaching profession. But when they decided to do when some systems decided to allow for integration, it was never a question that white kids were going to be taught by even better educated blacks. It was that at best, and people had to fight and die for this, for black kids to be educated by white teachers, and usually have to integrate into an overall white school system, right? And that's always a huge problem of integration. It's never about bringing people together. It's maybe allowing a few blacks to be part of a white system that isn't going to treat them correctly.
Oh man! And I just heard something. I mean, we could go on and on, but I just heard a story about, I think, and maybe you might have heard it, a casino, and how really this whole thing of integration is just one big gambling game. So some black people may roll the dice and win, but then the majority of us don't win. But that hope of winning keeps us believing in this system of integration, when the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said that it was just a hypocritical trick. And that we can see that today. Let's look at what this says. It says the median wealth for white families, and you touched on it, is nearly 10 times greater than that for black families. Black median income as of 2018 is $41,692, the lowest of all groups, followed by the Hispanics. White households is 70,000, and Asian Americans, the highest median income is 87,000. Can you that 10 times? And I think that
actually, brother, it's worse than 10 times in that I usually use the number of median wealth, not including depreciating assets, meaning, our used car, if you have to sell your car in order to, help you with a bill, you're in a very bad economic situation. So I don't even consider that like wealth you can access, right? So using non-depreciating assets the wealth of blacks is down, as I said, to a little less than $4,000. And if you compare that to someone whites who have median wealth, non-depreciating assets of about 150, that is over 30 times the amount of wealth that whites have as compared to blacks. And so those are the numbers I use. And just want to highlight, it's even worse than that 10 times number that people use when you include appreciating assets.
And can we talk about redlining? Redlining is nothing, today. I mean, they change words just like shell shock today is PTSD. And these words now today, I think redlining, you might as well say it's hyper segregation. And I don't even know why you would even need to put hyper on it when you're talking about segregation, because really the Black community is a colony. And a colony is something where assets and resources and talents are siphoned out of it and nothing is ever put back into it.
So, I think, you bring up the issue of redlining, and the organization that I work for, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, has done a lot of work in that area. They actually put out a paper a year or two ago that noticed, and I think one important thing about redlining is it helps people understand too that this wasn't, I think we already understand this. We're talking about enslavement and policy, but it wasn't people's personal prejudices. It was government policy, right? It was government policy that actually pushed to not do mortgage lending that might lead to blacks living in white neighborhoods, and saying that was unsafe, unsecure. So they literally made red lines around areas that they pretty much were saying there should not be investment and lending to. And the organization I work for did a paper and noticed that 80 years later, after redlining, which is happening in the 30s, around the 30s, that I think it was still 60% of those properties, of those areas, were mostly people of color, and 70% were still low income area. So 80 years later, that redlining is still having an effect today. And I think, that's, as we're talking about slavery or redlining, or the fact that the New Deal was pretty much a white deal, for white people, these still have living consequences. And, something I always put forward is America, and I like your gambling analogy, is they keep, they'll show the past Kobe Bryant or someone who's successful as like that is going to, that's what we all can be. And even beyond the race, the last 40 years, we just had a very regressive economy where even when the economy is going well, it's only the wealthiest that are gaining ground and are gaining the most wealth and resources from a growing economy. It used to be in the 40s till about 1980 that when the economy grew, actually low-income people might see the greatest growth in terms of their income. But since the 1980s, so today, we see that when the economy grows, that actually poor people lose ground. Have since 1980, the lowest 20% of households have seen their income decline by 7%, but the top 1% have seen their income increase by hundreds of percent. So when it's in a radically regressive economy, so even if things have opened up a little bit in a little bit of a less racial restrictions, we've had a radically regressive economy, which has maintained this deep racial wealth divide.
Yes, and I've read a report, and if I can remember, it said that since the COVID-19, that the billionaires have made over $300 billion extra, while all of us on the bottom one or 99% are suffering.
Yes, sir. I think that might have been in our white supremacy is the pre-existing condition report from the Institute for Policy Studies. If it wasn't in that report, the Institute for Policy Studies did another report around billionaires and highlighted those type of numbers, but it might have been in both of those reports. But I recommend people to Google white supremacy is the pre-existing condition, Institute for Policy Studies, and we try to look at concentration of wealth, the COVID crisis, and racial wealth inequality.
Yes, we definitely need to do that. And you touched on it, but can you touch on a little bit more about the powerful forces that are pushing against economic equality? You touched on the government, And then you also, with the slavery, the insurance agencies and corporations, are there other forces? Can you talk about a little bit more about that and give us an understanding of really this unseen satanic hand that really does not want uh, economic equality in America? It's a fear. I don't know, if you go in right on into it.
Well, I think the reason there's such fear around this is because to address it would require a radical change all throughout America. At best, when corporate America or white America wants to acknowledge racism, they want to point to some poor income white person who calls people names, maybe is physically violent. But they don't want to point to the fact that many of our leading banking institutions across this country made money off slavery, right? Many of these, I believe it was Yale and Brown University, have all looked at how much money, like some of them even owned slaves at one point as part of their endowment, right? And so I think that is the fear. And that's why it's always been such a problem to deal with the African American, because when you look at the African American, you're confronting the lie that this country was created by hard work, democracy, positive ideals, and you have to acknowledge it was created by mass enslavement. You look at indigenous people, genocide, taking of the land, theft, and that we still continue to this day to build off that and still manage to alienate and discriminate against these populations. So that's why I think it's so threatening, because, and I think it's interesting in this George Floyd moment, how it started off talking about police brutality, and then it started going in every direction. Then Aunt Jemima's being taken down. Finally, the ridiculously racist Washington Redskins name is being brought down. But we're seeing the white supremacist tentacles are all throughout society, and we have to deal with all of these different aspects. But we haven't really gotten to, and it's great. I'm glad statues are being taken down, things are being renamed. But my question for the Washington Redskins is, good, change your name. Now, how much are you paying indigenous people for the years of mockery you gave them? And they're still disenfranchised. What tribes are you giving money to? Like, what percentage are they going to get off of all the new logos and new gear that's going to come out with the new Washington name? And for us, and more generally, when is reparations going to come to actually deal with this racial economic inequality?
Absolutely. And then, of course, another thing is that even today, when it comes down to, you see reports going on all the time when it comes down to getting a loan for a car or a home or, a business, or even I have a nonprofit, or even doing a grant, trying to get a grant from these foundations. If it doesn't include a little white child who probably has what they need in their own community, you're not going to get that grant.
Well, and just real quick, a different trick on that, because I worked for an organization called Prosperity Now. It used to be called Corporation for Enterprise Development. And when I worked with a woman named Lillian Singh there, one of the things we were highlighting was that even if they're focused on, let's say we serve mostly African-American people or Latino people, what have you, the foundation money still mostly goes to white nonprofits that are, quote unquote, serving these communities. And if you know anything about how foundation money goes down, oftentimes a good amount of that money is captured in salaries of nonprofits. Right. So you're giving money to, and actually I've seen this here. I live right outside Baltimore. And after the Baltimore Rebellion, I kept hearing about all this money that was going into Baltimore to supposedly help deal with some of the inequality that was highlighted in the rebellion. And as I was asking some of the brothers in the mosque of small local nonprofits, you're getting some good funding. They're like, no, we haven't seen any of it. I live on a suburb outside of Baltimore, and I was talking to people I knew, and some of them were white people, and they were like, oh, yes, we're getting a lot of funding, right? So even when money's supposed to be going to deal with these issues, we still manage to have a system that is concentrating money among higher income, higher wealth whites, even in the name of helping Blacks or Latinos or indigenous people. So, like I said, the whole system has to be changed around, and we have to dedicate money, to those groups. Because one thing they'll say is, oh, well, whether it's a nonprofit or a Black for-profit business, well, it doesn't have capacity, so we can't give them the loan, we can't give them the contract, or we can't give them the foundation. But what I challenge foundations and corporations to do is no, you give contracts to them that will allow them to build capacity so they can do a bigger contract, right? And that's part of the wealth building work that we're all working hard on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Always, these businesses and corporations, white businesses and corporations and banks always use an excuse. They want to cut your leg off and then tell you to run a sprint, to sprint a mile.
Run a marathon, yes, sir.
Right. So it's absolutely ridiculous. As the old saying goes with Reverend Martin Luther King, they tell you to pull your pants up by your bootstraps, but you don't have any boots.
Yes, sir.
So let's talk about the devastating effects on Black children. 30% of Black children grow up poor, a rate that is 3 times that of whites, and as you probably would say more with your research. But 26% of Black children currently live in neighborhoods where the poverty rate is higher than 30% compared to only 4% of whites. And we know that this poverty, that this leads to now, which was not even, barely spoken of when I was growing up, the suicide rate that has crept up. Of course, our women are suffering from not only infant mortality, but maternal mortality. And then of the crime and violence that our young people are growing up in. And this is all, as Dr. Amos Wilson said, when you are he said, domination is the social ill. Domination causes the social ill. But can you talk about your research and the effects of poverty on our children?
Yes, sir. I mean, you painted the picture quite well. And I think one thing to think about in poverty is oftentimes we talk about poverty, we're talking strictly in terms of income, right? So if you have a certain, if you make less than, let's say, a household $18,000 a year, we might consider you in poverty, or depending on how many children are in the household, maybe it's 20, 24, what have you. But one thing I think is not focused on enough is asset poverty, wealth poverty, right? And that's, you were mentioning about African Americans living disproportionately amongst low income people. There have been studies that show even that high income Black people oftentimes have more low income people living around them than low income whites, right? Because again, because Black wealth is so absent that even when we have a decent amount of income, we don't have the wealth, and we don't live in the neighborhoods that manage to exclude, and which I don't want a super exclusive area, but the challenge is that even some of our higher income Black brothers and sisters don't have a lot of wealth. They have less economic security. Then we put more people in income poverty in their neighborhoods. And then we also, with that, provide weaker schools. And see, in a weak school system is an asset. Well, education is an asset. And if you have a weak school system, that means you're having a weak asset. And that's what we have all the time in our communities, usually weak assets in public transportation, in healthcare, all of these things. So it's not just that we're in asset poverty, that individually we don't have much money, or that even our family or community doesn't have much individual money. It's the state and city assets that we get the least of all of those things, which kind of double, triple, quadruple up on our asset poverty, which again, requires us to work very hard as individuals, but also requires us to demand systemic structural change so we get our fair share of community assets, which will allow us to help build up our own private assets.
Absolutely. And I interviewed Sister Zakia Sankara Jabbar, and one of the things that we talked about was the prison, the school to prison pipeline.
Yes, sir.
But even more than the school to prison pipeline, where you get a poor education, this rolls over right into the college arena, where we're paying higher debt. We get higher loans, which, at the end of this educational process of college, it's still difficult for us to get a job. And if we get a job where it's debts to the loan.
Well, there's several things around college debts. One interesting thing is Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, and Price did a report and compared blacks with college degrees and their wealth level, and I forget the number, to whites with a high school diploma. And whites with a high school diploma still had about twice the wealth of blacks and Latinos, actually, with a college degree, right? And again, because wealth isn't income. Like, your income can go up a lot in a year if you get a different job and they want to pay you more. But wealth takes a while to build because, if you get a high income, you first have to pay off your debts. You then might have to, spend some money to try to move into a better neighborhood. You have to have a whole bunch of money before you're able to actually be a homeowner. And then you have to have a whole bunch of money for a long time to pay off that home before that wealth level really goes up, right? And where your home is more an asset than debt level, right? So it takes much longer to build this wealth. And the fact is, we don't generally have long, sustainable, strong incomes that allow us to build up that wealth. And that's why it's going to require a structural change to deal with these issues. Yes,
sir. And that's another satanic vestige of slavery, is the fact that, generational wealth. And I like that you really pointed that out, that just because we see some of our athletes or entertainers with these large bank accounts doesn't mean that they're so-called wealthy,
That's right. Actually, I just want to pause on that point, because again, people can two things. One, back to the college space. One other thing that I think we also have to recognize is that still most blacks who go to college don't graduate. And that's what really kills us. It's like, if you graduate with a high student debt, you'll generally be okay. You're not able to accumulate as much wealth as you want to, but you generally will be able to get a little bit better jobs and be able to develop some type of life, somewhat economically secure life, but still not as economically secure as whites. But it's when you don't graduate and you got this debt that now you have even just a $10,000 debt or a $5,000 debt. That's a lot of money if you're making $10 an hour, right? And that really kills us in terms of that education, of higher education.
And you can't write it off. There's no filing for bankruptcy.
That's right.
So they trap you there. And we'll go on into the COVID-19 and now how that has impacted us. But I wanted to just touch on one more thing, and that is retirement and pensions after working years. This also puts us in a situation now, especially since we're basically gambling with the 401ks and putting our retirement on Wall Street and things like this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, you bring it up again. I was talking about how a lot of people don't realize this. America hadn't had a strong middle class economy for most of its history. But something that was really created 40s, 50s, massive government investments, New Deal. The United States was on top of the world because the European world was devastated by World War II. So we had the strongest economy. It really concentrated this wealth into creating a white American middle class. And during that time period, there was, strong living wage jobs where one breadwinner could bring in enough for an entire family, for a white family, become a homeowner, and you oftentimes would have pensions, right? Which would then mean that you didn't have to save or put money into stocks and hope you get a return. That you automatically were putting money away that was being taken out, and that you were guaranteed a pension, that you knew how much you were going to get after when you retired at 60 or 65, whatever the age was. But as part of the regression of the economy, or so a progressive economy went to a regressive economy, and it went to a regressive economy just as we were being more fully included into it, right? Just past the civil rights era, really forming in the early 1980s, that we started having less and less pensions, less and less union jobs. And now the idea is that we're going to empower you by allowing you, because the company used to put the money in the pension. Now we're going to take your salary, you're going to have to, and then you put it in the stock market and hope that you don't ever have to go into it to deal with a financial crisis or a recession or a health issue. and then whatever's left, that is supposed to be your retirement, right? And that's why the overwhelming majority of Black people's money for retirement comes from Social Security, because we don't have much savings. And then there was for a while talk of trying to cut back Social Security, and that would leave, like one other thing people don't remember is that the elderly used to be in absolute poverty so often. And it wasn't until the Social Security system was created and strong pensions that really helped make it more unusual for the elderly to be in mass poverty. But the problem is we still don't have that pension. We don't have that wealth. And we're just relying on Social Security checks, which barely keep people afloat. So, and that's where we see the greatest wealth inequality is in the later years, because wealth is something it takes 20, 30 years to build. And that's where you see the greatest difference is, 50, 60-year-old between Blacks and whites, where you have such, less wealth, and we live a long time. And it's very hard. It's hard enough to live paycheck to paycheck. It's even harder when you're not bringing in money and you don't have a paycheck.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess that's where we can move right on into the COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, and its devastating impact on the Black community. As you're saying that 40% of U.S. households lack a basic level of savings. It says that 31% of Americans don't have at least $500 set aside to cover unexpected expenses. For Black people, more than half of our households, 57%, are liquid asset poor. Can you explain what liquid asset poor means?
That's right. So when I was talking about median wealth for African Americans, 3,600, that includes if you have a home and your home is worth more than you owe on it, the money that's in the house is part of your wealth, is part of your assets, right? It could include some of your 401k. Liquid assets is money that you can quickly, sell your house is not very liquid, but right, to pull out of a savings account, to pull out of some type of money market fund. These things are liquid assets, right? It's something that you can use in the case that your tire blows or you lose your job for a few weeks, right? And again, the overwhelming majority of African Americans and Latinos, and I would assume Native Americans, are in deep liquid asset poverty, which then requires us to usually take out some type of predatory loan to try to keep our bills afloat, and so make sure we can still pay the light or pay our rent or what have you. That kind of continues this economic insecurity. But and just as we're wrapping up, just highlighting, I think we're all still wrapping our heads around this COVID crisis and what is going to be the long-term effects. It disproportionately is hurting us as a health issue, and it's disproportionately hurting us as an employment and economic issue. And I think, again, what many of us are just wrapping our heads around is that the challenge isn't that people might have lost their jobs for 2 or 3 months. What I'm concerned about is that I don't see us getting beyond this social distancing, less economic activity till at least 2022. And again, if the median wealth for Blacks is $3,600, $3,600 can't keep you going in a recession for a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. And so, I think maybe this September, we're just starting to see the long-term economic effects COVID's going to have on the national economy. But since we've been left so economically insecure, even more so with us. And again, those who are economically insecure are those who oftentimes too are in the weakest health and have the least ability to deal with this type of public health crisis.
Absolutely. And as you say, wrapping this up, if you could, after you answer this last question, give the people in the listening audience and viewing audience your contact information and any projects that you're working on and so forth. But to wrap this up, our responsibility, what can we, as a people do? Because as we hear that even if we come out of this, we were $1.39 trillion in purchasing power. However, it was saying that, the dollar doesn't even circulate within our community a day. But
Right.
within other communities, I mean, I'm trying to be funny, but you know, if you think about circulating, if you focus on that word circulation, and if you have poor circulation in your body, uh, it will atrophy, and gangrene will set in, and they will have to amputate. And so, you know, what would you say as far as what we can do? Another thing that I just wanted to say is that, you know, for many of our businesses, you know, if you look in white neighborhoods, they have a centralized area where their businesses are stationed, you know, these outlet malls or just malls in general. Ours are spread out. And so, I mean, I don't want to take up all day, but if
Yes,
you
sir.
could go and give some suggestions yourself as what we can do.
Well, I think, one thing I do think it is helpful. Some people get overwhelmed by it, but I think it's helpful to understand the structural inequality and a little bit of the history and present reality. Because I think oftentimes we see that we ourselves are in a bad economic condition and we can beat ourselves up all day on it and just
Right.
make ourselves, feel worse about us, and it doesn't help us advance, right? And I think if you have a better understanding that this isn't your individual problem, but it's part of a structural large problem and part of white supremacy, it's not your fault, but it is up to you to help take action, to advance yourself, your family, your community. And then I think, part of that is, understanding the depth of racial wealth inequality. What does it really mean to build wealth, right? And I was going to bring this up earlier. People, I have a real nice new car, and then I have an old Prius, right? And then people look at my fancy car and think, oh, he's wealthy. No, that's debt. It's the Prius that is wealth. The Prius is paid off for. I could sell it. It gets great miles to the gallon. So don't be confused by symbols of wealth, which usually is just debt. And what is wealth? And wealth is that old beat up Prius that I have, right? And that's no matter what happens, I have that car. If I lose my job, fancy car, but not that one. So, having a better understanding of wealth, and then having understanding of the long-term planning and kind of discipline it takes to build wealth, and not to be, and there's different aspects of wealth, right? You might give up a job that pays you a little bit more, maybe waitressing or being a waiter or something like that pays you more, but you can take another job that actually gives you health insurance or that gets you days off, right? Those are also assets. So having what I call a kind of a wealth building understanding of assets, and figuring out what asset is most important for you right now. Maybe a safer place where your kids live and a better school system. It might be worth to move out there with a little less paying job, because in 20 years that's going to pay off more. But really having a wealth building mentality, not I just need higher income so I can buy the next good, which is actually just debt. So those are, and that's something I've been working with the Association of Financial Counselors, Planners, and Educators to develop financial education that deals with racial wealth inequality. Because right now, most programs, they have all of this literature, but none of it was designed to deal with our socioeconomic condition. And so we go to the financial education programs, we're still not doing well, and we think it's our fault, but it's never designed to deal with our condition. So trying to help develop financial education programs that actually deal with racial wealth inequality. So, these are, knowledge will help you, discipline, and actually even just being able to talk about our money issues. So oftentimes, many of us want to look good and dress good, but we're falling apart. And so, and I had this working in organizations. I've had community leaders during the Great Recession who were about to lose their house, and they reached out to me. And I had contacts at banks that could have helped them, but they reached out to me 2 days before the house was supposed to go on. And that's too late. I can't do it. You got me a month ago. I could have talked to the bank and helped you, but 2 days beforehand, you can't turn that around. So don't be scared to talk about this economic challenges that we're all having, whether we're college educated or have no degree. We're all having issues around economic insecurity. We need to talk about it and support each other more.
Yeah. And maybe, since we're now just opening up to being able to talk about our mental health status and state, like you said, brother, we need to start talking about our economic status, our financial status, and not be embarrassed, because like you said, what is the embarrassment for? In many cases, it's a systemic and institutional racist system that has us in these situations. Before we go, once again, if you could if you could tell us, give us your information, and also give us, if you can, some of the books that we should pick up. For one, I would suggest people get How White Folks Got So Rich. That's an excellent book to understand the historical perspective. But if you could give us some of the books that you read and would suggest for us to pick up.
Well, great. Would love to do that. I mean, I think one of the books that have been very powerful in helping understand racial wealth inequality is a historic book called Black Wealth, White Wealth. That the 20th anniversary edition came out recently, maybe 2 years ago, that gives updated information on this issue. There's been several books, including the original Color of Wealth that was written in connection with United for a Fair Economy. The Color of Banking that was written by Mirza Baradaran is another book that can be very interesting and be helpful. I'll highlight that I've helped start a Race and Wealth podcast network. And on that network, we highlight not only the big structural issues, but we also have financial planners, financial counselors on regular conversations with them about what we can do in our daily personal finances to help advance our economy. So I would recommend checking out the Race and Wealth Podcast Network that has a variety of shows that can help empower you and help educate you. And then if you're interested in some of the writings that I do, you can find me at Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide on WordPress. You can find me at Bridging the Racial Divide on Facebook, where you get a daily article on different issues of racial economic inequality. And I guess that's and then you can find me at Twitter at Dedrick M. But definitely try to put out different reports, different analysis on ways to approach dealing with this issue of racial economic inequality.
Yes, sir. Thank you, brother. I really appreciate your time and you coming on here to help us understand the dynamics of the income disparities that affect our community. And once again, we're with Brother Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community at the National Community Investment Coalition. And once again, thank you, brother. And we look forward to hopefully talking to you again on this topic. And hopefully we're in a better position, because it's up to us. We can turn things around. Things don't have to be doom and gloom, but it takes, as the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said, for us to pull our resources together, to unite, and to do something for self. So thank you, my brother. May God continue to bless you and your family with safety and prosperity.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You as well. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. And we want to thank you all for tuning in once again. Join us every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we go into the subject a little deeper than most people go into it, because this is the Black narrative. We're going to go in and talk about issues impacting our community from a Black perspective. And if you don't have a Black perspective and a Black understanding of the dynamics that are going on in the community, everything, as one person said, if you don't understand white supremacy, everything else will confuse you. So with that, I want to leave you as I came before you in the greeting words of peace. We say it in the Arabic language of Assalamu alaikum, but in English, it simply means, it's a prayer that simply means peace be unto you.